The most frustrating thing about cosmicism is the idea that there is some truth that is unknowable, or that if a human mind is exposed to this inscrutable truth, that mind will break into madness. In a lot of ways, this is reminiscent of J.J. Abrams' mystery box storytelling, the way Lovecraft seems to keep some huge revelation just out of view of the audience, tantalizing us with shadows and reflections bounced off the reactions and narrative of characters who see the supposed horror. As you may expect of someone with my username and record of disliking J.J. Abrams, I don't tolerate the idea of purposeful ignorance well. And so, like a foolish Lovecraftian protagonist, and many of you, I delve deeper trying to find answers. Cosmicism is the idea that man is not important in the cosmos. The deities and powerful entities of the world are indifferent towards man and human civilization, and therefore human striving is meaningless. That is the same frequently repeated analysis you'll find plastered in hundreds of videos across YouTube, articles on the internet, or opinions in print media. Like 1,000 mouths bubbling to the surface of a gibbering Shoggoth, they are all repeating the same thing. But this is an unsatisfactory answer. Why is this enough to drive a person mad? This just seems like baseline postmodern nihilism. If you're watching this video, you're probably not old enough to even remember a time before the 1960s cultural movements in Western countries completely demolished the Victorian fantasies of Christian capitalist imperialism. Britain and France gave up their colonies, and American media centered on misgivings over our role in the Vietnam War and oppression of racial minorities for decades. All of the other analyses you'll find leave out this important context. Lovecraft was writing at a time before the complete collapse of the Victorian concept of modernity. None of these other Lovecraftian analyses start where they need to start, with the culture of Victorian colonialism and specifically the genre of adventure literature. Unlike the present, the end of the 19th century represented a near full 100 years of practically unbroken peace and prosperity for Britain. While the Imperial Army and Navy was frequently engaged overseas in minor skirmishes and the occasional foreign war, the Boer War and Crimean War come to mind, neither the British homeland nor any of its major foreign interests were seriously threatened by conflict. And even in America, there was an era of colonial optimism after the completion of Western expansion in the same industrial Gilded Age that existed in England. The fiction of that era frequently involved intrepid British travelers to exotic locales who would get into dangerous situations before escaping with exotic treasures, kind of like James Bond mixed with Indiana Jones. Sean Connery played both James Bond and Indiana Jones' father. He also played a character named Alan Quatermain in The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Quatermain is overtly the literary basis for Indiana Jones, being a character invented by H. Rider Haggard in the late 19th century, shortly before H.P. Lovecraft was born. 1985's King Solomon's Mines is based on Haggard's novel of the same name, and you can see how much it looks like an Indiana Jones movie. We know Lovecraft read Haggard. Lovecraft mentions Haggard's works in his writings. While there are elements of Haggard that Lovecraft agreed with, you can see that much of Lovecraft's writing is a negative reaction to Haggard's view of the world. Indeed, much of Lovecraft's work involves an Indiana Jones or Sherlock Holmes-like character suffering some awful fate as a result of their adventuring in a foreign land or pursuing academic curiosity. The optimistic viewpoint of the indomitable human intellect of Holmes or the courageous boldness and martial skill of Jones/Quatermain has been obscured in the contemporary audience's mind by a century of morally ambiguous great powers warfare and conflict. But for Lovecraft, these representatives of human greatness, or pridefulness depending on your perspective, were relevant enough to be his literary targets. Take the story The Hound, for example. While this is a reference more to our example of Sherlock, with the Hound of the Baskervilles being extremely directly referenced in the title, I want to start by talking a little more about how this references something more associated with Indiana Jones. To be clear, Indiana Jones was created after Lovecraft's death, but the trope of an English-language explorer stealing treasures from exotic foreign locales is exactly the Victorian colonial adventure tropes in which Indiana Jones is based. And I think most people don't realize it, but the first part of The Hound is an absolutely raucous satire of British museum culture, one worthy of having been authored by a recognized humorist like Oscar Wilde, but instead was penned by the master of cosmic horror. Howard Carter unleashed an Egyptomania media frenzy when he opened King Tut's tomb during the time Lovecraft was writing and revising the story in 1922 and 1923. Although Lovecraft reskins exploring ancient tombs of pharaohs as robbing a Dutch graveyard, just listen to these lines from Lovecraft's The Hound while open to the idea that he's actually making fun of British Egyptology. I cannot reveal the details of our shocking expeditions or catalogue even partly the worst of the trophies adorning their nameless museum that we prepared in the great stone house where we jointly dwelt, alone and servantless. Our museum was a blasphemous, unthinkable place, where with the satanic taste of neurotic virtuosi, we had assembled a universe of terror and decay to excite our jaded sensibilities. Around the walls of this repellent chamber were cases of antique mummies, alternating with calmly lifelike bodies perfectly stuffed and cured by the taxidermist's art, with headstones snatched from the oldest churchyards of the world. Niches here and there contained skulls of all shapes and heads preserved in the various stages of dissolution. There one might find the rotting, bald pates of famous noblemen, and the fresh, radiantly golden heads of newly buried children. H.P. Lovecraft in The Hound. You can kind of tell from how frequently he specifically uses the term museum that he was trying to make a point. But that's not the only attack on Victorian narratives in The Hound. The fact that the Hound of the Baskervilles is not mentioned pretty much anywhere on the internet in relation to the Hound is frankly a shame on the general practitioners of literary analysis. It's extremely explicit in the title. In addition, both works are about fears of the capitalist forces changing Victorian society. To start with, The Hound of the Baskervilles was written after Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had been avoiding writing another story about Holmes. He had even killed off Holmes in the previous Holmes novel 7 years prior. But still, people were pressuring him to write another Sherlock Holmes novel due to the money that could be made. You could even say they were hounding him. The Doyle novel is about a very rich family who is threatened continually by a supposedly demonic hound. Eventually, through the course of the novel, Holmes, through the power of deductive intellect, reveals that the killers were not supernatural demonic entities, but neighbors jealous of the rich family's wealth. By Holmes's intervention, the rich target of the killers survives an attack and goes on to travel the world. Notably, the haunting of the family is mentioned as having started near the time of the English Civil War. In Lovecraft's story, we start, of course, with the satire on British museum culture, as I mentioned, which is not that directly related to Doyle's work. The protagonist and his accomplice rob an idol out of a grave in the Netherlands and are pursued by a similar demonic dog-like entity to that in the Doyle story, complete with an ominous, threatening howling. After causing the death of the accomplice in a dog attack, the stolen idol is at one point again stolen from the protagonist by a poor family. Later, the protagonist retrieves the idol from the family's apartment after the thief's family had been viciously killed in another dog attack. He then returns the idol to the Dutch grave. Now, to fully understand the reference to the English Civil War in the Netherlands, you need to know a little economic history. The English banking system and currency developed in the wake of the English Civil War. Banking, in particular, was a practice mostly imported from the Netherlands. The violence in both stories represents class tensions and crime driven by the developments in the banking system, international trade, and the Industrial Revolution. However, unlike Doyle's story, where the issues are resolved by human ingenuity and the Victorian British legal system allowing the wealth to be enjoyed, in Lovecraft's story the threat is never confronted, and the representation of material wealth, the idol, is returned to the grave from which it came. This is the stuff they don't tell you about Lovecraft. How he was reacting to a very specific viewpoint he was experiencing in his contemporary culture. A viewpoint that is no longer widely held or understood today. How no one mentions the context of these late Victorian and pre-war authors Lovecraft is directly referencing in the titles of his work is baffling. I could easily have discussed H. Rider Haggard's book She, which Lovecraft reworks into his short story He. Both feature an immortal sorcerer responsible for corrupting a city and a thriving empire, and both center on fears of civilizational decline. How on earth does the Wikipedia entry for Lovecraft's He not mention Haggard's book? I want to talk a little more about other parts of Gothic horror which immediately preceded Lovecraft's writing and which were referenced in his essays and letters. The werewolf and vampire both represent similar Victorian modernist views on the role of material dominance in industry and science for werewolf stories on one hand, and culture, particularly Christian altruistic values, but also egalitarian Protestant educational values, are represented in vampire stories. While the use of a silver bullet to kill werewolves is fairly directly representative of Western dominance of international trade and access to silver and industrial ingenuity in the gun, this precise method of killing a werewolf was only authored in 1941, years after Lovecraft's death. But we can look at Rudyard Kipling's Mark of the Beast as an example of werewolf literature known to Lovecraft, and in fact specifically referenced in his writings. In Mark of the Beast, one of a trio of white colonists is infected with lycanthropy after defacing an idol of the Hindu deity Hanuman, one of my personal favorites. The themes of Western scientific and industrial might prevailing over the wildness of the Indian jungle pervade the story. One of the first references to this theme is the bitten character sarcastically suggesting that the Hindu temple will bring a lawsuit due to his act of defacement, a clear reference to the Victorian view of native cultures solving disputes through violence rather than through legal proceedings. Later in the story, the bitten man is portrayed as being stricken with sickness, only to be cured when his two compatriots manage to capture and torture the biting werewolf. They use a gun to conduct the torture, making a very similar reference to firearms and, by extension, Western industry that the later silver bullet stories make. This is pretty clear symbolism of Westerners using more advanced weapons technology to impose what the Victorians would view as the institutions of civilization on the native populations. And though the references to medical technology, similarly taming the microbial dangers of the jungle, are more oblique in Mark of the Beast, Kipling's The Tomb of His Ancestors follows the story of a tribe encouraged by a white military leader to take the smallpox vaccine. Yes, the natives being anti-vax was a problem in colonial India. So while werewolf stories provide a representation of what late Victorians may have viewed as Western dominance of the physical side of things, in a humane distinction between scientific or physical issues on one hand and cultural or spiritual issues on the other hand, vampire stories can be seen as representative of Western cultural dominance in the face of the threats of the Victorian age. England had been a center of textile manufacturing since the mid-1700s, but by the late 19th century, it saw much of this industry exported to Russia, particularly through Sava Morozov, becoming extremely wealthy exporting textiles from Russia with cheaper Russian labor in worse working conditions. While obviously Dracula is an Eastern European nobleman, Bram Stoker also symbolizes this fear in the ship the Demeter, which brought Dracula to England. It is based on the Dimitri, an actual Estonian ship likely bringing textiles to England, very much like a modern container ship bringing iPhones in fast fashion from China. Stoker's character of Van Helsing is an educated man of religion who uses his faith and knowledge to beat back the threat of a wealthy foreigner intent on victimizing young Western women. Van Helsing's knowledge and the fear Dracula has for the cross is representative of the cultural power of education and Christianity to keep the negative forces of wealth inequality, globalized trade, and immigration at bay. The Victorians viewed Christian altruism in various charities as an effective way of addressing the problems of wealth inequality, and Christianity, together with Victorian education, provided a strong basis for cultural assimilation of foreigners and protection from more primitive forms of feudal hierarchy. So in this dichotomy, we can see a view that the shortcomings of Christian altruism, namely the possibility of being seen as weak due to kindness, are covered by the strengths of Western industry. That is, you can afford to be nice if you're just able to shoot people if things get out of hand. And on the other side of this dichotomy, we have a view that the shortcomings of the methods of economic and military physical dominance are covered by Christian altruism or humanist values. In the wake of Charles Darwin's theory, Victorian society had adapted older Christian beliefs into a kind of scientific Christian patriotism, which saw British white people as the pinnacle of the Creator's biological evolutionary process, and Christian or humanist altruism as the pinnacle of a parallel kind of cultural evolution. Lovecraft disagrees with this view. Kipling is perhaps most representative of the ideal Victorian best of both physical and cultural spheres view, seeing Britain and the West as using their superior physical might to altruistically lead the world. We can contrast this Kiplingian view with Haggard. Haggard seems to have a more jingoistically mercantilist view, which centers more on Victorian physical dominance and is less concerned about Christian or humanist morality. Haggard himself spent time fighting in the Boer War in South Africa, and based his character Alan Quatermain on a British game hunter, Frederick Selous. In Haggard's stories, we are likely to read about a swashbuckling British hero kicking native ass and sleeping indiscriminately with their women, like a 19th century Captain Kirk, before making off with a pile of their gold. Of course, another contrast with his rosy Kiplingian view is Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, another author mentioned in Lovecraft's letters. Conrad can be viewed as having a pessimistic perspective on Western imperial adventures centered on humanist altruism. In effect, he's the inverse of Haggard's jingoist view, where he sees the mistreatment of natives by Westerners concerned with material wealth as bad due to his own altruistic concerns. Of course, you are likely familiar with Francis Ford Coppola's retelling of Conrad's work, Apocalypse Now, starring Martin Sheen and Marlon Brando, and this is exemplary of our contemporary altruistic anti-colonialism. A lot of people call Lovecraft a white supremacist. It should perhaps be obvious with how often his white modern men of learning meet tragic ends due to their own hubris and overconfidence that these people are wrong. But do not take an ounce of comfort in that, for the truth is much, much worse. The truth is that for the vast majority of people, you will not like what Lovecraft stands for, whether you consider yourself anti-racist or anti-woke. Lovecraft may be a racist, but not technically a white supremacist. While he did see blacks as inferior, he held all non-black races as essentially on the same plane of equality, including Japanese, Chinese, Indians, Latinos, and Native Americans, as well as the various subdivisions of whites into things like Aryans, Celts, and Italians. In a letter, Lovecraft explains this point. What we mean by Nordic quote-unquote superiority is simply conformity to those character expectations which are natural and ineradicable among us. We are not so naive as to confuse this relative quote-unquote superiority, we ought to call it conformity or suitability instead, with the absolute biological superiority which we recognize in the higher races as a whole, as distinguished from omitted for YouTube. We know perfectly well that the Italians excel us in the capacity to savor life and beauty, that their centers of taste are better developed than ours, but they annoy us and fail to fit into our group because their gland functionings and nerve reactions do not correspond to what our own heritage has made us expect. We do not call them inferior, but simply admit that they are different beyond the limits of easy mutual understanding and cultural compatibility. H.P. Lovecraft, letter dated January 18, 1931. Lovecraft views Aryans as superior in the way that he views cats as superior. He understands it as simply a matter of his personal taste and compatibility. There is no objective superiority. You see, like some critical race theorists, it is most accurate to say Lovecraft is a separatist. Critical race theory also has practitioners which believe that races are incompatible and must be separated. Here, in a bibliography where a couple founding critical race theory practitioners were trying to form a definition of the field of critical race theory, they cite racial separatism as one of the defining themes. 8. Cultural national separatism. An emerging strain within CRT holds that people of color can best promote their interests through separation from the American mainstream. Some believe that preserving diversity and separateness will benefit all, not just people of color. Delgado and Stefancic in Critical Race Theory and Annotated Bibliography. We can very easily understand why critical race theorists and other anti-colonial theorists would have a negative reaction to Rudyard Kipling's optimistic view of capitalist modernity and British paternalism. Kipling literally wrote the infamous poem, White Man's Burden, extolling the United States to invade and occupy the Philippines for paternalist reasons. A woke activist would argue that no matter how much Kipling and other white people think they are improving the living situation of natives, it is all an illusion, and the real motive of white people is nefarious colonial oppression. And while Lovecraft's views are slightly different from the woke, it is a distinction that mostly does not make a difference. Lovecraft would view the possibility of improving the native people's lives with equal skepticism to that of a woke activist. But he would also view the possibility of whites improving their own situation by colonizing with similar incredulity. Only a damn fool can expect the people of one tradition to feel at ease when their country is flooded with the hordes of foreigners who, whether equal, superior, or inferior, biologically, are so antipodal in physical, emotional, and intellectual makeup that harmonious coalescence is virtually impossible. Such an immigration is death to all endurable existence, and pollution and decay to all art and culture. H.P. Lovecraft, letter dated September 27, 1926. So for Lovecraft, it isn't a matter of superiority or inferiority. He would argue that black Africans would be equally upset at white colonization as whites would be with the presence of blacks in their societies. And this is the awfulness of Lovecraft and cosmic horror. It is a pessimism over the possibility of doing good for both other people and yourself by attempting to travel outside your native area and comfort zone. Like Haggard, Lovecraft is unconcerned with altruistic moralism. Like Conrad, he opposes the colonial project and international capitalism. But unlike Conrad, who opposes colonialism for altruistic reasons, Lovecraft opposes colonialism for selfish reasons. He doesn't see anything in it for white people. He views the confidence that people like Haggard place in the physical dominance of Westerners as misplaced pride, in addition to seeing the humanistic altruism of Conrad and Kipling as foolish. In effect, Lovecraft is arguing that because we are nowhere near as secure in our physical dominance as Haggard and Kipling would argue, we cannot afford Kipling's generous, altruistic values. This is what cosmic horror means. Go home, white men. Your sense of self-importance is overinflated, and you are in more danger than you realize. Shun the outside world. Not because you dominate and are better than it, not even really because it will pollute you, but because you have adapted to a very narrow environment, like one of Darwin's Galapagos Island finches, and it is best not to stray into some other environment where other finches are better adapted. Lovecraft suggests in Cosmicism that a more base, animal-like aversion to outsiders and new ideas is the best strategy in navigating the world, that white men should act as a Kiplingian Victorian viewed natives as acting, with uncivil, sadistic, and brutal and curious hostility towards outsiders, an intensely ugly suggestion. This is perhaps most clearly illustrated in the story He, where the evil immortal sorcerer corrupting New York is defeated by the risen spirits of Native American tribesmen that the sorcerer had betrayed hundreds of years prior. This anti-colonialism and isolationist view of white powerlessness could very easily be embraced by woke writers. An actual woke Lovecraftian work could have centered on powerlessness of the white colonial protagonists, or potentially even more appropriately, portrayed white people as the bizarre betentacled monsters looming ominously over people of color. This is why Lovecraft Country's choice to do a Monster of the Week episodic style with very few references to Lovecraft was so disappointing for me. While I don't agree with wokeness or Lovecraft, in a lot of ways, Lovecraft was woke. YouTuber Never Knows Best made a video wondering why it is so hard to make a video game that effectively captures Lovecraft's feeling. The reason is likely that powerlessness is at the heart of Lovecraft's perspective. Lovecraft's work is like the opposite of a power fantasy. It is a powerlessness fantasy. A video game based on Lovecraft's themes would be one where everything the player character does is ineffective and there is no way to win. In cravenness, as opposed to pridefulness, you sink into sin because of your fear and not your overconfidence. Lovecraft's work defines the word craven. And I think you can see how it is actually worse than being a white supremacist. Kipling is much more of a white supremacist than Lovecraft, yet it is clear that Kipling, with his humanist altruism, is morally superior. Lovecraft is against the highest parts of humanity. All the things we think are great about humanity, our intelligence and kindness in particular, Lovecraft views as unwarranted pridefulness. And this disrespect to the concept of intelligence, and curiosity in particular, make him bear legitimate resemblance to J.J. Abrams' mystery box style. And in a similar way to J.J. Abrams' mystery box-based stories that are thematically based in Lovecraft's cosmicism are a way of wallowing in ignorance and powerlessness. But cosmicism is not nihilism, and I don't know if that makes it better or worse. Cosmicism makes a very definite suggested course of action, that biological individuals should try to stay in the environment they evolved within and resist invasion by outsiders or changes to that environment. Unlike nihilism, which suggests no definite course of action, cosmicism suggests regressing to an animalistic, conservative isolationism. In this way, it is ironically similar to critical theory in abandoning empirical science in order to use older, moralistic modes of thinking. At least in existential nihilism, pursuing liberal modern humanist values is viewed on an equal plane with selfish, ignorant isolationism, rather than actively suggesting hostility to ideas and outsiders. Let me draw a distinction between the aesthetic of Lovecraft and the underlying themes. Lovecraftian has come to mean basically all of what used to be considered weird fiction, with the term Lovecraftian being anachronistically applied to things like Robert Chambers' King in Yellow, in addition to anything involving creatures with body structures radically different from Earthling tetrapods. True Detective is a good example of weird fiction that opposes Lovecraft's themes, although it has aesthetic similarities and references Lovecraft's work. My most popular video is an explanation of True Detective's optimistic message. And like True Detective uses the aesthetics of weird fiction, a story could be written with a tentacle monster or Shoggoth that reflected a triumph of human ingenuity or universalist altruistic values. But if you wanted to open the mystery boxes of Lovecraft's cosmicism, we needed to look at the themes. So now you know some of the secrets of the universe. Was it worth it? If you aren't screaming in a newly commenced bout of insanity, I would very much appreciate you hitting the like button. Also, if I said something that made you think, please consider subscribing to my channel. This has been Shiva's Right Foot, and I'll talk to you next time.